All right, I can see my sound is on, so I'm going to be able to start. I um I moved, so I'm in a different location, and therefore I'm hoping that this live stream will go a little bit smoother. So, as advertised, I want to talk about the book of Christopher Hector, The Making of the Modern Warmblood. And so, what I'm going to be doing is I'll be talking about the book, I'll talk about the author, and then I'll talk about what is covered in the book. Like, where does he go? What does he cover? What I liked about the book, what I didn't like so much about it. And finally, who is this book for, really? And then, if anybody happens to be on the chat and would like to ask me a question, I'll try to answer them. Because I'm not at home, I don't have the book with me, but I do have my notes. So I'm not sure how much I can answer specifically about the book. That is not in my notes, but anyway, I will. I will talk about what I do have. All right, so let's talk about the book. So first of all, it's a beautiful book, right? It's a hardcover. It's very well put together. The paper is a nice glossy paper, so the pictures are just coming across as beautiful. It's well bound, so no question there's a book of quality. It is heavy. It's not something you're going to be reading in bed with it over your head because you might get a concussion. I weighted it actually because I thought it was so heavy. It's actually just a little bit over 2 pounds, so that's about 1 kilogram here that you have in your hand. And there's no fluff. It starts on page one and ends on page how many pages there? 647, I believe. Yes, 647 pages. So it's quite dense. It was published in 2010. Something we'll come back to a little bit later, but it's a 2010 book, and it was published straight from the actual. The publisher is not a common one. It's a publishing house that is associated with a website and a company that was built, I believe, by the author. And so it's not available on Amazon, but it is still available directly from the publisher, and that is Sport Horse International. And I will put the link down in the description after this video is all over. So it's not available directly from Amazon, but you can certainly still get your hands on it after you listen to everything I have to say. If you think this is the book for you, if you're interested in it. Shipping is expensive again because of its weight, but it's totally my opinion. It belongs on my bookshelf, and I'm happy to have it there. So, what else can I do? That's about the book, about the author. So, Christopher Hector. Christopher Hector has been writing about sport horses and their breeding and their evaluation and where this whole breed is going for over 20 years now. So he's very well known in Europe because that's where he spends most of his time. Although he is Australian, he spends a lot of time in Europe. He goes to the major Stallion shows, he goes to the big sporting events. People recognize him now by face, and therefore he has access to a lot of breeders or breed inspectors or even breed officials. So he does have an in with them just by the fact that he's been there for so long. People know him. They know that he writes regularly for his column that he now publishes online. Again, it's called Sport Horse News. Again, I'll put a link down in the description if you're not familiar with it. So, Chris Hector is a journalist. So, I think that's important to keep in mind the whole time that I'll be talking. He's very much a journalist. He's not a horse breeder. And as far as I know, he is not a rider. So, nothing in what he has written has given me the impression that he breeds horses or that he rides them himself. But he's obviously very familiar with the world of warm blood breeding. But it's his journalist approach is something you got to keep in mind because that's going to come back through a theme that I have throughout all my comments is that this is written very much from a journalistic point of view. Um, he he was formed as a journalist. I don't know where else he would have worked because he seemed to have been working on this aspect of bringing news to people for, as I say, over 20 years. So he did write this book in 2010. I think I'm not sure if it's because of its criticism or just because he has so much material. He did publish another book just last year in 2024, in which he really focused on not a handful, more than a handful, because it's still another big book, but on stallions. Okay, but this book is more about the history of the Warmblood, so it covers way more than just talking about the stallion, which I'll get into that. So how does he approach? So because he's very journalistic, he's very fact based. He's very critical. He doesn't have any allegiance to any particular registry, so he can afford to be, I guess, critical and looking into the details and pointing out some of the conflict or some of the contradictions. Sometime that comes up when you talk about breeding for sport, breeding for amateurs, breeding for professional. So all throughout, you can sense that he very much doesn't have a dog in this fight, which is the typical journalist approach. It's not a vested point perspective. He is also quite detached, like you don't see any major effusion of a feeling of emotion. So it's very factual, very historical based type of writing. Um, he interviews breeders, and it's interesting to see the type of question that he asks, because he can be his questions can be a little bit leading, and I think I understand why, in the sense that breeders are not sorry, necessarily the easiest people to interview. First of all, it's hard to explain how you go what's your breeding philosophy. Not everybody has come up with like speaking points to what it is that you want to say. So breeders can be a bit guarded. They also are not gonna publicly either talk against their registry, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, or they won't necessarily want to talk badly or in any ways that could be interpreted as badly about competitors or about other breeders. So it comes across as being giving pretty guarded answers. So I think in reaction to that, he's been asking questions that are quite, sometimes a little bit leading, a little bit pointy, a little bit critical of the decision registry make and how things are progressing. So just be aware of that. They don't want to get political either, so that's another thing. He claims right from the beginning, like he in his introduction, he says, "I don't want this book to be very dry about this stallion, this son, and this." But it ends up being a little bit like that again because of his very factual and detailed approach. But ultimately, yeah, it's not always easy to read him. It's not that his craft, his writing craft, is in any way difficult to read. It's just that it's a lot. It's 644 page of information. So it's not something you read on one go, let's put it this way. Because of his journalistic approach, he also doesn't have any references, right? Like when you read an article in a magazine, you don't see references in the back telling you where that information, where they got that information. It's part of the understanding that as a journalist, they have consulted various material, they've interviewed people, but don't necessarily have that information. And this book is pretty much like that. There is no references, there's no indication of specifically where he got his information. He will once in a while mention a book that he has read and that he pulled information from. He'll mention it, he'll mention the author, and then move on. But it's built into the text. It's not at the end. So good luck finding that particular text later on. And it's written, I think it is meant to be an encyclopedia. It is meant to be a reference book, but it actually, in reality, it's not. I've read a lot of reference book and I've read a lot of encyclopedia, being my age and having grown up in the era of the library rather than the internet. And the important thing about an encyclopedia is that you can find the information you're looking for. If you're looking for something, you can find it. This book has no reference, no ways of you of finding information within it. What I mean by that is there is no index. So, for example, if you want to say, well, I'd like to know what the Hanoverian director has said about something, you remember reading it in the book, good luck finding it. The table of content is at the beginning, of course, that's there, but it's the organization is a little bit baffling. Like, I really don't understand how he organized his book. And so it makes looking things up a little bit difficult. Um, it's almost like he wrote a series of articles and he kind of smushed them all in a book. That's what it feels like. So lots of great information, really hard to find anything in it. So keep that in mind. The organization of the book is, well, it is Christopher Hector's way of looking at it. I'm sure it made sense to him. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it is, again, more of like a magazine collection of articles. Okay, so what does the book cover? So the probably the most interesting part, I would think, to the majority of people is that he covers the history of the various registries. So that's really good to read in quite a bit of detail. And he talks about the great stallions that has influenced the breed in general. And I said the breed, not the registry, because we know that stallions can be bred to mares from various registries. So he's looking at influential sires and he follows them down the line, meaning he'll start with one stallion and he'll go to his one of his famous sons, and then from this famous son another famous son. So you can kind of follow the progression of the stallions throughout. In terms of the registries, it's great because he covers pretty much all of them. So I have a list here. So he talks about the Hanoverian, the Oldenburg, the Holsteiner, Trakehner, Dutch Warmblood, Swedish Warmblood, the Sal Français, Jangerscheid, I never know how to say that one, the Z, that was put together by Leon Melchior, Oldenburg PSI, which is much younger than Oldenburg, the Irish Warmblood, the Belgian Warmblood, and the Westphalian. So he has a section on all these registry in which he goes back and says pretty much where they started and how they evolved over time. And that's quite interesting. He puts it in the historical context, but he's clearly not a historian. It's not meant to be a historical book. So if you have a good understanding, at least of the basic of the basics of what was happening in Europe throughout the 1600s, 1700s, like you have a passing understanding of that history, then that makes sense. But what he does is that he gives you a little bit of historical context. He mostly does a lot of name dropping, like King Philip II of Spain at that point. And if you don't know who he is, it's just a name. If you happen to know what he's known for, what his goals were, then it'll give you a lot more information, obviously, to bring this within context. But he doesn't do that, right? He really focuses on what the registry history, how it progressed through the ages. He talks about also what was the demand put on the registry. So while we might understand now as a demand on, for example, the Dutch Warmblood as being top Olympic performers, what was it back in like 1850? What were people looking for? So that's interesting to see because it clearly has greatly influenced the path of these various registries and eventually breed. So he talks about that. He talks about how the not the politic, but I would say the thinking behind how to select animals have evolved from at some point early on only focusing on stallions, then moving on to licensing stallion, meaning picking the best of the best, to eventually incorporating, looking at the mare line and testing mares as well as stallions. So we see that evolution that is very different from one registry to the other, for sure. They have their own method. And it's interesting because he also ventures into the future. So remember, this is published in 2010. We're in 2025. So whatever he says about what he thinks the future hold, well, you can kind of check, see if he got it right. So it's interesting to read to go, well, I am in the future for him. I am 15 years, and 15 years is almost 5 horse generation, right? Because a horse generation is about 3.5 years. So it's interesting to see what he had, not him. Again, he doesn't put himself in it. As a journalist, he's asking others, where do you see the sport being in the future? So it's interesting to see it now and see if they got it right or what part of it they got right, or anyway. So that part is interesting. There is lots of picture. This is an absolute gem of a book for looking at how the physiology, not the physiology, what am I saying? The phenotype of the horse has evolved over time, because he has pictures and paintings of specific horses that were influential or that represented the breed over time. So it's really interesting to see how the type has evolved and how it's changed. Of course, with the advent of photography at around the turn of the century, of course, the number of pictures explode. But prior to that, we had engraving and we had some painting, and he does bring some in there. He also has collected the description of these horses that came from various sources. So obviously, well researched. And if you're a visual person, I think that really helps, because I don't think there's I don't think there's a page that doesn't have some sort of illustration. Like when you open the book, there's pictures everywhere, and they're good quality. And the annotation isn't always the clearest, but as you read the text, you totally get to who is representing those pictures. So that's definitely a plus. So I quite enjoy that. He has uh, other than just the story of the registry, he also has like interesting asides. They're like standalone little articles. So back to this idea that this book is actually like a collection of articles. So he has articles about various. He calls them, I guess, in like side trips. Anyway, can't remember the name exactly. Interesting asides, I would call them. So, for example, he has one on the loss of the traditional breeder in Germany, whatever that was. So, this idea that maybe in Germany, with the traditional breeder was the one that was a farmer and had a couple of horses and that would breed a couple of foals. And now things have changed, of course, and now we have much bigger breeder. We have breeders on an almost industrial scale, meaning they have switched their operation. They no longer farm for food. They don't no longer have a variety of animals. They focused on the horses, right? So I'm not quite sure what he's getting at, but that's what I meant, that he has sometimes a little bit of an idea of a critic, or anyway, he brings that up. So he has a whole article where he talks about different people that have seen both the old way of doing it and now, and what they think about it. He talks a lot, not talks a lot, but he has definitely over the years written quite a few articles about the breeding index, how they're calculated, how various registry keep track of all the statistics in order to kind of say this stallion has a dressage breeding index of 143. They'll calculate them slightly differently, although they're starting to get more coordinated. He's quite critical of these statistics. And that's perfectly fine. So, but he talks about how they were developed, and not into the mathematics. Don't worry, I'm not going to lose you there, but more about how how it evolved in terms of what information is being brought in, what is considered important changes over time, and therefore the information that is involved or included in these calculations also changed. So that's an interesting one. He interviews the big breeders. By big breeders are the one that are, first of all, producing big numbers, but also the one that are consistently bringing stallion to licensing and standing stallion. So he has a couple of interview with them. Again, like I mentioned earlier, he has an in with them. He's well known, so I think he can approach them. What else did he say? He talked about the decline of the regional studs. So we understand, like I covered a little bit in my description of what's warmblood and how registries are different than breed and all that. I did talk about the fact that originally there was no transporting semen. The transporting horse was difficult. So there was all these regional stud, like satellite stud, and they moved the stallions around, of course, to prevent inbreeding. And it was quite a bit of an operation. But each region could basically bring their mare to that stud and then have their mare covered. But that's going away, because obviously the majority of mares now can be bred with transported semen, and therefore that has declined. And there's some plus and minuses to that. So he talks about, so that's an interesting aside. He also talks about the fact that the warm blood has taken over the English riding discipline, in the sense that now when you look at upper level competition, 99%, maybe 95% now are generally traditional warm bloods. We don't see a lot of thoroughbreds, or if they are, they're part bred. We do see the Iberians coming up, absolutely, but they are also modifying. their horses to make them more warm blood like in order to compete. So he talks about how this happened, like how they took over, how they became so very much the breed of choice for people looking to do dressage or jumping. So that's an interesting aside. He has a whole section on the importance of the thoroughbred. The thoroughbred was very much brought in to refine, to bring heart, to bring legs, to bring stamina into these heavier horses that they had in between the wars. And so the influence of the thoroughbred is very important. And he has a whole section looking at which thoroughbred stallion were used where, and a little bit about the why, but also their influence down the line. Like, where do you find them now in the pedigree of some important horses? So that was pretty cool. And again, with pictures and engraving and painting. So you see the models that the breeders were choosing in order to improve their horses. And the thoroughbreds of today don't quite look the way they looked back then. They have evolved too. So that's interesting from a breeding perspective. Um, so that's the various sides. Now, another big chunk of the book, and the reason I brought it, I bought it, was the individual stallion review. So he'll spend anywhere between a page to 2 page. So we're looking at probably 800 to 1,000 plus word on some specific stallions. So he covers 144 of the big names. I mean, if you look at Warmbloods, if you own one and you look at their papers, you will find one of them in the background. Absolutely, no matter if you have a jumping horse or a dressage horse or mixed and all arounder, you will find these stallions. He really touch on the big ones, and like I say, he follows them down the line, right? So he will take the original one, or at least he probably works backward. He probably looks at a stallion that is influential today. His sire was influential, his sire was influential, and back that way. So that's really cool to follow that up. It is dry reading, despite his effort to make it more interesting and saying, well, I'll try to get away from he sired this one and this one sired this one. It remains a little bit dry because he focuses mostly on the stallions as, again, as a journalist, not as a breeder, not as a rider. So he reports on usage of the stallion. Where was he used? How many mare he covered? How many of his babies performed? And that can be a little bit dry. And it doesn't tell you anything about specifically what the stallion brought forward. What I like to do in my stallion video, if you watch any of them, is to really look into, what does the stallion bring? Is it the temperament? Is it the superior movement? Is it a particular physical characteristic that seems to be passed on by that stallion? So I'm quite interested in that, because as a breeder, that's what I'm interested in. How does a stallion complement my mare? He doesn't present that. And maybe in response to this, he published a follow-up book of sorts. So in 2024, like I said, he published a book called Heroes, which really focused just on the stallion. Now, I have not read that book. That one is available from Amazon, so I will probably get my hands on it at some point and read it. But that's a little bit the downside of this book, particularly when they're talking about the various stallion review he does. I was left wanting, basically. I'm like, oh, great, he was bred by such and such, who also bred such and such, and he stood at this station, and then he was sold there, and it's all very factual, and we kind of forget the animal in all this, and I think that's unfortunate, because I was interested in the animal and knowing what was going on there. So just be aware of that. It is a good reference in the sense that you have the pedigree, but these days you can find the pedigree online easily enough. It gives you the backstory about who owns what and all that. Anyway, if you like that type of thing, I mean, it's not hard to read. It's just a little bit dry in terms of facts. So, what did I like about the book? So, I think you can pick out through what I said so far. Definitely the photos, the historical context. I wish you would have given me a little bit more. Again, unless you're well versed into what was going on in Europe during that time, you might be a little bit lost. Like, why did the monks have the horses in Oldenburg? There's all this whole idea about the monks were raising the Oldenburg horse. I'm like, okay. And then Philip of Spain only wanted, I believe it's Oldenburg or Holsteiner. Sorry, I don't have my notes or the book here. I think it's one of them. So he's in Spain. They're breeding horses in Spain, but he only wants horses from northern Germany. Why? I don't know. They were top of the line. At the same time, Louis XIV also wanted those horses. So that brings an interesting. It's like, oh my God, we're talking about the 1700s here, and there was already like a specialization. These horses were the cream of the cream, the cream of the top. Sorry, I didn't get my expression right, but they were the top according to the royal. Why? It doesn't say. It just, I guess he found out that information somewhere and he passes it on. So that historical context, I would have liked to see a little bit more of it. I loved all the registry story. That was really interesting to see how, for example, I had no idea, but the Swedish stud is basically a complete melting pot of all the various warm bloods from Germany. They and some from France too. It's really a melting pot. But at one point, they started to really have a preference for the East Prussian horses. East Prussian, not Trakehner, but closely related, but not the same. They brought a lot of those stallions. And that's why today, to this day, when you look at a Swedish warm blood and you look back, a lot of the stallions are not in the other stud books, right? They brought in from a different part and then they built on that. So things like that, right? So those are little gems that you find out here and there. So, what I did not like about the book, well, despite the fact that it is absolutely packed with information, like I say, there is no index. I can't find anything. I know I've read it, but I can't actually go back and say, oh yeah, where did he talk about Capital One, that very important stallion? I'm like, oh, there was something interesting. Well, I don't know where I can find it. And if he refers to Capital One outside of the section on Capital One, I'll never find it short of rereading the whole book. So that's a little bit annoying. So if you want to know if he covered a particular stallion, you go to the table of content. That's where you will find, oh, there is a section on Capital One, and then the section on his son and his grandsons, etc. Great. But if it's mentioned anywhere else, I won't find it, short of reading the whole book. So that's annoying. Um, the weird organization, like he starts with the history of the Hanoverian and then he jumps about the future of the Hanoverian. You're like, okay, so far makes sense. Then he talks about a stallion, but he doesn't mention if it's particularly important to the Hanoverian, so relatively recent stallion. And then he goes into an interview of a Dutch breeder, and then he goes back to the story hopes. Like he's all over the place. And again, maybe the organization made sense to him. I didn't see the connection. I didn't see a flow. And so I found that a little bit frustrating. Again, his attitude of being quite detached, himself not being a breeder. On one side, it's good because, like I say, he doesn't have any allegiance. On the other side, I would like to see more of the animal aspect coming through. I didn't get that. It's a bit frustrating because you like the horses, you want to know about the horses, but all you get out of it is facts. Bred at this day, covered so many mares, so many licensed son. You're like, okay, but what about the animal itself? I was hoping to see a little bit more of that. Maybe it's in his follow-up book, like I mentioned, the 2024 book called Heroes. It's titled Great Stallions and the People Who Bred Them. So I'm hoping maybe there's a little bit more on that. So I'm going to conclude this on talking about who is this book for. So anybody interested in the history of the warm blood? I mean, the title doesn't lie. It really is the making of the modern warm blood. If you want to understand what were the forces and the pressures and the animals and the politics behind creating the animal that today we think of as the warm blood with all its various registries, that's the book for you. Um, and you will need to read it from cover to cover. Like I say, you can't just jump in and see. Well, I suppose you can. You can jump in and read a little section, and then see, cover something else. But you need definitely to keep a page marker of some sort. Um, so if you're okay with that drier approach where it's fact, this and that, then that's great. It's definitely for anybody that's interested in seeing the evolution of an animal as we breed them, because like I say, it's chock full of pictures. Most of the stallions that are presented, he has found a conformation picture, which is great because you can really see in the standard way stallions are, not stallion, warmbloods are presented with the stance. You can really look at their conformation. Um, a couple of them, he only has pictures of them over jump, so you don't get to see the structure of the animal. But I think he made an effort to really represent them all in their conformation shot. So that's good, because I have to say these days that when you look at stallions these days, the promotional material, you'll get one conformation shot and that's it, right? So it gives you something to compare to their ancestor. One picture that struck me personally is that I was reading the section on Grand. So he was a Hanoverian stallion, and he happened to be the great grandsire of a mare I had. So this mare was by Veldmare, and moved like a Veldmare, a beautiful mare. And then when I came, well, I look at the picture of Veldmare and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I can see some similarity. But oh my gosh, when I saw the picture of Grand, I went, that's my mare. So great grandsire on the mother side was coming through her like really strongly. So that can be pretty cool if you can look at a confirmation picture maybe of a stallion you're considering and seeing how well it matches its ancestor. So I thought definitely a good side of all those pictures. So that's what I have to say. That's my conclusion, in the sense that if you're interested in the history of it, if you're interested in finding good pictures of those stallion, understanding their impact on the breed, it's a good place to go. Now that it's 2010, no, sorry, now that it's 2025 and it was written in 2010, um, most of these stallions are, well, I don't say well off, but more than likely they're off the pedigree, the papers that you have for your horse, right? They only go down 3 or 4 generation. Now we're already looking at stallions that are much further back. But I still think that it's valued. I still think it's important to know where these horses came from, where they're going, how they're evolved, and to understand the whole context of that. So that's my review of the book. I finally had this live stream working. It's only my 6th attempt, but I have moved. I actually am out visiting my mother, and she has better internet than I do. So there you go. That's the fun of living in the country. Don't have perfect internet. Great for download speed. The upload speed, I think, was the problem, because clearly this stream has been no problem at all. So anyway, I'm going to conclude here. If any of you have any questions, either now or later on, you can certainly ask them. But that's all I wanted to say. So thank you for those of you that watched now or later, because obviously this will be published, and we will see you in the next video, probably in about a week. So that's the plan. So anyway, thanks for joining in. And I will end that stream and let you get on with your day. Bye.